Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage. Monday night edition, March 2024. I'm out here in the shop working on my dot-blocked, dot-headed 440 cubic inch LS twin turbo engine project. Since the last video, I installed the cylinder heads and torqued them down. In a perfect world, and I'm not done dreaming up a setup, I would circulate hot water through the engine, a couple hundred degrees, a few times and let it cool off, and then retorque the cylinder heads right here. That's the easiest way to do it. Now, my car's not going to be that bad, but no easier time than right now. And I'm thinking maybe if I just had a lobster pot full of water on a lobster burner, propane, outside, hook up a couple hoses to my electric pump. This doesn't sound like that difficult a project, so I'm going to work on that. But next on the agenda, now that I've torqued the cylinder heads down, I need to measure for pushrod length. It's always critical on an LS because your valve train is non-adjustable. Super critical, I have Lanati short travel hydraulic lifters. So that is an animal in itself. And we're going to get to the specs on that in a minute before I bore you with a bunch of numbers and math. Going in, I know my intake and exhaust push rods are going to be a different length because I have titanium intake valves and each one has a lash cap, so that all the valves are in at the same installed height. The valves are all the same length. I add a lash cap to the intake and I have to subtract from the push rod, so the intake valve push rods are going to be shorter. I know that going in. So I'm going to spin you around. We got to talk about those days you didn't pay attention in math class, like me, and you wish you did. The procedure for installing the rocker arms, measuring for push rods, setting valve lash, or in this case, lifter preload, it all hinges around the same theory. It's EOIC, exhaust open, intake closing. That is when, valve by valve, we're going to work on it. So if you take one cylinder, has one intake valve, one exhaust valve, when the exhaust starts to open, you're watching it as you're rotating the engine in direction of rotation. When the exhaust valve starts to crack, you're free to work on the intake valve. It's where it is on the base circle of the cam where it needs to be, and you can install the rocker arm, you can measure for push rods, you can set the lash, whatever you got to do on any engine ever made, that'll work. When you're done working on the intake valve, roll the engine over, watch the intake valve open all the way, and start. I bring it about halfway back up towards closing, and now I'm free to work on the exhaust valve of that cylinder. It's that simple. So exhaust open, work on the intake. Intake closing, work on the exhaust. So we're clear on that. A lot of people see on an LS engine, all the rocker arms are on a bar, if you will, and the bolts go down through it. They just set it on there and gun it down. That is not the right way to do it. You still need to install them individually. You can gun it down, sure, lots of people do. Just not me. I don't recommend it because you don't know where everything's at. It's a lot less strain if you're doing it where you're supposed to be doing it. So that's that. So to measure for push rods, you need an adjustable push rod to allow you to put it in place of a real push rod, put the rocker arm on, get to zero lash, and in the case of a smaller big block Chevy, you're going to check the sweep over the valve, adjust the length, so that's good. And then when you're ready to set the preload, you can do that on the stud too. There's no, it's not infinity. There is a physical limit to how far you can go, but basically you're unlimited on your adjustment. On an LS engine or any non-adjustable valve train, this valve train, when you tighten the bolt on the rocker arm tight, that's it. It has to be tight so it doesn't fall off. But as you're tightening it, you need to be setting the correct lifter preload. So, how do we figure that out? You need to know the thread on the bolt that holds the rocker around. On an LS engine, it's M8-125. Metric bolts are somewhat easier initially to figure out how far in one turn the nut or bolt travels. If you're putting a nut on a bolt, if you go one turn, in this case M8 1.25, M8 is the diameter, 1.25 is the pitch. That means in metric terms, simple, it goes 1.25 millimeters per turn. So now that we know that, we have 1.25 millimeters. The Lanati instructions that came with the lifters tells us that with a cast iron block and aluminum head, we need a 30 to 35 thousandths preload on the lifter plunger. So we know it in millimeters. Now we need to convert that to decimal. Fortunately, in the world we live in, we have online calculators. So M8-125 goes 0.0492 per turn, so almost 50 thousandths. So one turn would be too much because we need to fall between 30 and 35 thousandths as we tighten the bolt on the rocker arm on the LS cylinder head. So, and that is from zero lash. I'm going to show you how I set it to zero. I put the rocker on and adjust it so there's no preload on the lifter, but there's no slack, there's no lash. That is called zero in this case. And then from that position, I need to determine how far I need to go before the bolt is tight. Using a little math, if we went 3/4 of a turn, that's 36, almost 37 thousandths. That would be acceptable. So 3/4 of a turn is the maximum we want to go. 5/8 of a turn is 30 thousandths, almost 31 thousandths. So we need to be between 5/8 and 3/4 of a turn. If you want those exact numbers, I have them. 5/8 is 0.03075. 3/4 turn would be 0.0369. So that's the range we need to fall in. So we're going to set the rocker to zero, put the ratchet on it, and when I tighten it, it should go no more than 3/4 of a turn. And you have to do that cylinder by cylinder. And a word, if you have brand new lifters like I did, the first time you do it, it feels kind of spooky because there's assembly oil and whatnot in the lifters. You don't know if there's oil in there. I didn't pre-soak them. It says not to. The second time, so I go ahead and do this and then back it off. The second time it will feel normal and it will repeat till the end of time or until you pump up the oil in the engine and probably run it. Then you might have to start over. But as it sits on the stand now, I've checked every one of them and they all now will repeat. So the trick to get to the 5/8 to 3/4 turn is you need to keep taking the rocker back off. There's not a lot of room on an LS engine. On a smaller big block Chevy, you can put this either way and you can spin it and keep doing it. In LS, you got to take the rocker off every time, unless you got tiny hands or a way to do it. It's just easy to pop the rocker back off. Adjust this a little more, try it again until you fall in that range. Then you need to go over, the only special tool required in this whole job is something you can measure 7 or 8 inches with accurately to the thousandths, because you need to, well, if you want to have push rods made to the thousandths, you could if you're some weird number. But traditional push rods available on the shelf are going to be probably every 25 to 50 thousandths. So if you want to buy something commercial on the shelf, which I do, and I have a tiny window to work in, I fortunately got to the point where I could measure, and I already know my intakes 7.900 and my exhausts 7.950s, and they're available. All I gotta do is push the button. But me being me, I came out after dinner and I want to check it again. So let's do that. I'll give you a break from having to stare at me. You can stare at my beautiful engine. I watched as I rotated the engine. The number one cylinder, you can tell which valve is which by how they line up with the ports. I'm going to be checking the exhaust. So I watched the intake lifter open all the way and go halfway toward closed. I'm ready to install my push rod and rocker arm. Number one exhaust. This is the adjustable push rod I've been using. It's set to 7 inches, 900 thousandths. I am right-handed, but for you I'll work kind of left-handed. That's setting in the plunger of the push rod. If I wanted to, I can push, I can feel the plunger. I know it goes up and down, and it doesn't take a lot to move the plunger. The rocker arms that ILMOR Engineering chose to run on this former ILMOR 396 is a stock rocker. I believe it's a Crane trunnion upgrade on LS3 and LS7 heads. The exhaust rocker is still straight, like a traditional LS1, but the intake rocker is offset to clear the giant port. So I have a straight rocker. We'll set it right on there, kind of self-aligns. We're just going to tighten it down by hand till there's no lash left. Okay, I'm going to back it off a little bit. I don't know if you can hear me tapping. Tapping went away. Tapping? Tapping's gone. That is zero lash. There's no preload on the lifter. There's no lash in the whole system. Zero. Now, take a ratchet. I'm going to put it on. And in theory, this needs to be tight somewhere between 5/8 and 3/4, so when I actually torque it, I don't go any more than 3/4 of a turn. That's not quite, it's about 5/8. By the time I actually tighten that, by the time I went to 18 foot-pounds, whatever this is, I haven't looked up the spec, I'm going to be just shy of 3/4 of an inch. Done. Now, you could check just one cylinder. I checked them all. Push rods, by the time you buy 2 different sizes in sets of 8, that's about $200. You don't want to get them wrong. This engine had 3/8 push rods in it, 80 thousandths wall, one piece, and that's what I'm buying to put back in it. That's larger than a traditional LS, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead tonight and order them. And when they get here, I will go around one by one and install them cylinder by cylinder, valve by valve. This is what the engine had in it. You can see it's marked. This was 8050, 80 thousandths wall. It's a nice push rod. Perfectly usable if it was the right length. With stock, in this case LS lifters, you have probably 100 to 150 thousandths window instead of 30 to 35 thousandths on a limited travel lifter. That is how people get away with not checking anything. What makes the push rod length change? The cylinder head itself, the way the valve seats are cut, the length of the valves, the thickness of the head gasket, the block and cylinder head deck surfaces. Every time you change that, again, with stock lifters, you have a big window of error. With an engine like this, I wish this engine was solid lifter, but the camshafts and stuff I have are hydraulic, and eventually, I guess I'll have less maintenance to do. I don't mind doing maintenance, but if it was solid lifter, I would have to have an adjustable valve train. So it would be more expensive as well on an engine that came originally non-adjustable. The problem area in engines, the only trouble I've ever had with the engines I've built, and I started on probably one of the hardest engines on valve trains, a big block Chevy, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing, which has led to a lot of valve train trouble, especially as I tried to get more exotic. My first roller cam was a horror show. I could do a whole video on it, but it forced me to figure stuff out. So while it was $300 back then, which was all the money. It seemed like I spent a fortune and wasted it because I pretty much destroyed it. I learned, so I guess it was a cheap education. But if nothing comes out of all the videos I've ever done, I hope I can just take what knowledge I've learned and spread it around. Because once again, the old rising tide theory, if we all learn, we're all better off. I'll never understand people that are afraid to tell you what you need to know. And be accurate doing so. I try to be accurate. If I'm wrong, I'll correct myself. But stuff like this, well, I've been doing this since I was a teenager. I just turned 59. I've done it for a while. Made every mistake you could possibly make. So, are there people that are smarter? Yep, sure is. Never forget that. You're not the best at everything. And if you realize that and learn from the people that can teach you stuff, you can. You just need to, and you develop a sense of who can teach you stuff and who can't. So that weeds itself out pretty quickly. I'm rambling now. I'm going to get back to picking up my tools and going back inside and pressing the button and spend another $200 on push rods. Have a nice evening.